Hi folks, welcome back. I am the Sharply Dressed Man, and today we're going to be talking about PvE Bow DPS in New World. We're going to be talking about a number of things, including strengths and weaknesses of using the bow in PvE DPS, gear and perks to look out for, including best in slot bows as of Season 3, stat allocations, bow talents, and offhand weapons you should keep an eye out for when you're doing bow DPS in mutations and raids. And also a little bit of a talk about attacks and rotations, about how to use your abilities most effectively. Welcome everybody, hello, and here we are. I've been focused on bow DPS for quite a while, ever since Season 3, that is the beginning of the expansion a couple weeks back, started, and I've had a lot of questions about how to maximize performance with a bow in PvE, specifically in New World, and today we're going to talk about all of that. So let's just get started. We're going to be talking about a lot of subjects, but first of all I want to talk about what are the strengths and weaknesses of the bow, right? So, when you talk about the bow, a lot of folks will be thinking about big single target damage, and that is definitely one of the key strengths of the bow. Big single target damage. But one of the things that you also find is that it is a very flexible build, because it focuses on dex, which shares a lot of different weapons that you'll find also useful in PvE, including things like the spear, the greatsword, and the life taker, and the rapier. So there you go. Very flexible, focuses on dex, useful for other weapons as well. It has access to a lot of good party-wide utility, including things like enfeebles. If you're using the life taker, has a nice consistent rend. If you're using a spear, it has a nice consistent weaken. It's just a really good weapon for flexible raid damage and utility. Weaknesses. Weaknesses of the bow. It does not do great. Does not do great AoE DPS. That is not one of its strengths, but you can have access to other weapons that can kind of offset that. Arrows are expensive, and they're necessary for you to maximize your damage, orichalcum arrows particularly. It actually requires good aim. So if you're not very good at aiming, you're going to miss your shots, you're not going to do great damage. Let's see, there's not a lot of great options for breaking stamina with this weapon. You're going to be relying on your offhand weapon, primarily if your objective is to break stamina on a particular target. This comes in really critical for certain bosses like Thorpe. Thorpe's adds, you have to break their stamina as soon as possible. The bow is not a great option for that. And the last thing to say about the weaknesses is that tanks will hate you because this weapon will draw a ton of aggro. Particularly if you're using the life taker. Life taker will cause you to do an enormous amount of damage, and you'll pull a ton of aggro. Alright, so there's the strengths and weaknesses. Summarize. Let's get into the meat of the guide that I think most people are interested in. Let's talk about gear and perks to keep an eye out for in that gear. We're going to talk about the armor you should be looking out for, best in slot bows, and perks on those bows that you should keep an eye out for. And throughout all of this, we're going to make the assumption that you're using orichalcum arrows, because there's just no reason to use anything else. You should be using orichalcum arrows all the time. Alright, so for armor, let's talk about this first. You're focusing on light armor, right? I haven't really seen a really good convincing reason to use medium armor with the bow build, but you should be using light armor for the extra damage. The perks to keep an eye out for. Here's my priority list. I always try to have a maximum stack of refreshing. That is 4 to 4 stacks, right? 4 pieces with refreshing. I'm not gonna be so prescriptive as to say that, you know, which pieces must have refreshing on them, but you should have a combination of gear which has 4 out of 4 refreshing. And we're also going to assume that this is all 700 gear score. Number 2, health. This is really important, because you should, if you're doing PvE DPS with the bow, be able to survive at least 1 hit from an enemy. If it's from a trash mob, they should be able to come over and hit you once, and that'll give you enough time to recover, give your healer enough time to heal you, give you enough time to get the aggro back on your tank. So that's, and you should be aiming for between 10 to 11k health. Thirdly, elemental and physical aversion. All right. So we're going to be you need to be talking about damage mitigation in these cases. You want to make sure that you can survive the hits that come your way. Next, freedom and invigorating. These are not super high priority. These will reduce the duration of snares, roots, things like that, the duration of some dots. Effectively, it will make you a bit more survivable, but they're not critical. Maybe 1 or 2 stacks of each, just to round out the build a bit. And lastly, everything else. All right, so that's just everything else falls into it. Just doesn't matter which perks you get. Just find some things that you think look nice. Optionally, and this is optional because this kind of makes your gear a bit more specialized. Keep an eye out for penetrating rapid shot. Keep in mind this should be on armor, not on the bow, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And empowering explosive shot. This is build specific. You may or may not be using explosive shot, but this is also pretty good because it buffs some of your other abilities. Okay. Next, let's talk about jewelry. Alright, so we've got 3 different things. We're going to get a lot more specific about what needs to be here because there's a lot of things that only come on certain pieces of jewelry. Alright, so we're talking about for amulets. Look out for, number 1, some kind of elemental protection. This can be, fire protection, arcane's less useful, ice, and nature. Try to make sure that they line up with the damage that's dealt in the higher level mutations in your M3s, right? So if you have a fire protection amulet, and you load the rest of your gear up with some opals, you're usually pretty good to go in terms of absorbing the rest of the damage that's done passively inside of those dungeons. Fire, ice, nature. The last one would be void, but I don't know of a good void option just yet. But keep an eye out for those elemental protections on your amulet. Really important. Number 2, empowered. I like this because bow does not have really great sources of consistent empower aside from the 15% from the dodge. So I like to have empowered on here because you're going to have to be relying on some like outside sources for empower, and you want those to last as long as possible. If you're using, and also this is contingent on if you're using keenly empowered on your weapon. Number 3, healthy. Again, you want health. You want to be able to survive those hits. If you have enough HP, you might be able to trade this in for something else. Number 4, divine. Increased healing taken, right? Make it so the healers can heal you more quickly, and the healing potions that you have are more effective. Number 5, you can also pick up refreshing. If you need another stack of refreshing to round out that 4 out of 4, you can pick that up on the amulet, and then everything else. Just as a note, I currently use the Empty Hearth. This is a fire protection amulet from Empyrean Forge. Alright, let's talk about rings. On the ring, this is going to be, you have to get very specific here. You definitely want thrust damage. 100% want thrust damage. If you can find it, poison damage as well. There is a ring out there that has both. Finally, keen awareness. And then lastly, if you can't get all 3 of the top ones, look for leeching. I love leeching because it heals you up from the periodic damage that you take from just passively being in some of those higher level M3s, and hardy, which increases your stamina. All right, I currently use Soul Pollen. Soul Pollen. It comes from Garden of Genesis, I believe. I just crafted this from the Gypsum Forge. And then the best in slot, the one that comes with thrust and poison, is called the Wood Grain Ring. And this drops off of high level named Angry Earth in Eden Grove. So if you want to check that out, it comes with both thrust and poison damage, and it can be crafted up to include something else. like keen awareness or leeching or something else that you enjoy. So look out for that. Okay, finally, earrings. Number 1, absolutely must have refreshing toast. 100%. You've got to have refreshing toast, otherwise the earring is just not nearly as useful as it could be. Number 2, I like nimble. This is increased stamina regeneration. And then finally, it's anything else that you think is nice. So there's no... I don't really have a third recommendation for earrings. Refreshing toast, nimble, this can be like duplicating toast, empowering toast, you know, something else that you think is good. I currently use like thirst. This comes with a refreshing toast, a duplicating toast, and a third one that I don't recall. Okay, that's all of the armor that we're talking about here. All right, so just to summarize once again, you should be using light armor, you should have 4 out of 4 refreshing, you should be focusing on health, damage mitigation on your armor pieces, on your jewelry, your amulets, elemental protection, empowered if you can find it, because you need to maximize the usage of your empowereds. Healthy, divine, and then anything else. On your ring, 100% thrust damage, poison damage if you can find it, and then keen awareness, leeching, or hardy. Farm up that wood grain ring from Eden Grove. Or you can buy yourself the soul pollen for 2 out of 3, pretty quick. On your earring, number 1, refreshing toast, gotta have it. All right. Number 2, nimble. That is your increased stamina regeneration. And then finally, anything else. I like duplicating toast because it saves me some money. All right, let's talk about best in slot bows. So for best in slot bows, the perks you want to keep an eye out for, these are the highest damage PvE DPS perks. These are Keenly Jagged, some kind of elemental attunements, and Enchanted. You can also make an argument for Keenly Empowered. Okay, so let's talk about which ones you might want to use in certain situations. If you have Keenly Jagged, this is for single target DPS, and here's why. Keenly Jagged does not scale to groups. Simple as that. If you do an AoE and you score multiple crits, only one of those crits will result in a dot from Keenly Jagged, right? So it's a single target thing. However, one thing to say about this is it does work with battle precision. This is the 20% increased dot duration from the bow tree. It's a talent. What this means is Keenly Jagged has a really strange interaction. It's normally a 6-second dot with a 7-second cooldown. If you apply that 6-second dot with a 20% increased dot duration, its duration then exceeds its cooldown, and it will stack with itself up to 3 times. So it'll just continually, you'll just continually see more and more Keenly Jagged dots on the target up to 3 stacks. And if you can maintain it, that is to say, if you can continue to crit, then you will maintain that all throughout the fight. Right, that's a lot of damage. Optionally, if we're talking about Keenly Empowered, this is a good option if you're talking about AoE DPS, because this does scale. It applies to everything that you do. This is a 10% in power, 5 seconds, with a 10-second cooldown. With Empowered from the amulet, this is 6.7 seconds. All right, pretty easy to do the math here. This is a 6.7% overall damage increase in everything that you do. So I'll go into a little bit more about why you might want to use this later, but this is a really good option for if you don't want to use Keenly Jagged, or if you want something that's a bit more AoE focused. This would be the final perk that you would go for. So you'd use some kind of elemental attunement, you'd use Enchanted, and you'd use one of either Keenly Jagged or Keenly Empowered. The best in slot bows right now are the Syncretic Bow. This comes from named enemies in Brimstone Sands. And if you are impatient like me, you can also craft the Oil Jar. This comes from, I think it's the barnacles and black powder materia. And you can craft this into, this comes with an attunement and enchanted. You can craft either keenly jaggered or keenly empowered onto it. So this is a pretty solid option if you don't have the time to farm up a syncretic bow, or if you already have a lot of materia kind of kicking around. You probably do if you did the battle pass. Alright, so then you can craft keenly empowered or jagged. Okay, so there you go. Those are the gearing options. Take a look at those. If you do that, you'll be really well set. For stats, let's move on to stats, the next topic. I've already did a really, like a 13-minute video on how to allocate stats, so I'm not going to cover too much here. I'm just going to say I use the attuned leather pants for the additional stats. This makes it really easy to pick up additional stats in the other trees that aren't dex. I currently use 100 strength, 455 dex, 50 int, 15 focus, as to say I don't put any points in focus, and 15 con. Don't put any points in con. And then I use 48 con food. When I combine this with all of the other perks I was talking about previously, like healthy on different parts of your gear, this gives me between 10 to 11,000 hit points, which is enough for me to survive a single hit in an M3 if I happen to pull aggro on a trash monster. Generally gives me plenty of time to respond. But your mileage might vary. So there you go. Stat allocation. If you want to see more details about why I chose those stats, feel free to check out the video. I'll link it in the comment below. Okay, talents. Let's talk about bow talents. There's a lot of discussion here about what to use for bow talents. I'll just say this. Rain of Arrows is an AoE that does 150% weapon damage to everything in its target, and it applies a dot. I think it's a 25 or 24% dot with a 100% uptime. If you also include the 20% increased duration from the bow tree. So don't overlook Rain of Arrows. It is a fantastic ability for AoE. Your primary single target ability, however, is Rapid Shot. Rapid Shot is extremely powerful, especially when you get to like below 50% hit points. You'll be rapid shotting constantly. In fact, you'll have just enough time to use one ability between every rapid shot, which is perfect. So don't worry about that. For your single target, Rapid Shot is effectively the only ability that you need. And then finally, the big dot that we have is Poison Arrow, Poison Shot. All right. I recommend taking all three of these. You can make an argument for using Penetrating Shot instead of Rain of Arrows, but I would definitely use Rain of Arrows because it does the same damage. It's on a shorter cooldown, and it has, or it's on a similar cooldown, and it has a dot that it applies as well. So those are the three that I use. Let me see. Did I get logged out? Just gonna do a real quick. I'll show you what my talent tree looks like, and then you can take a quick screenshot of that. Okay, finally, well, second to last, let's talk about offhand weapons. Generally, you're going to be using one of 4 different kinds of offhand weapons. You're going to be using the Life Taker. This is critical for big single target DPS, right? Life Taker provides a ton of utility. Here's why. It adds a 30% Rend, adds a 15% damage, weapon damage dot. So you're constantly applying this dot, you're constantly applying a Rend. The Rend applies to all the damage that your team does, so you're increasing the damage that everyone in the team is doing to the target. The only drawback is that you deal so much damage and you apply so much aggro, you're going to be pulling a lot of aggro with this. It pulls a ton of aggro, so make sure that your tanks are prepared for this, alright? On trash packs, if you start to really unload, you're going to draw aggro on one or two things, so just be prepared for it, or spread out your shots across the entire pack. Try not to focus on one single thing, because that thing's going to come for you and it's going to try to kill you. Alright, so it has a lot of utility, great for single target, adds a bunch of damage, tons of aggro. So that's Life Taker as an offhand. The second thing you should be considering is a spear. Use this if your party needs Enfeebling Skewer. Alright, so basically that's the only time I would use this at this point. If your party needs some kind of additional utility, like maybe they need some Rends, maybe they need some Enfeebles, you should be using the spear for utility, and then using the bow for damage. In fact, if you're not using the spear, you should be using the Life Taker instead as your offhand. Okay, so the next one is Greatsword. Use this if you need to break stamina. This is good for the Thorpe boss. Like I said, for the ads, they have a stamina bar that you really need to break quickly, right? Put the bow away during that phase, pull out the Greatsword, start doing some heavy attacks, which is the Greatsword's bread and butter, and there you go. Finally, I've got to mention this because everyone's going to bring this up, the finisher. If you're using the finisher as an offhand, then you are not a bow build, you are a finisher build. So let's make that very clear. You're not using all dex, you're using dex and int. And you should be focusing on maximizing your finisher DPS and not your bow DPS. Alright? Maximize the finisher, not the bow if you're using finisher. The bow is a supplemental weapon to the finisher. Okay. There you go. So those are all your options for offhands. I love using Life Taker, personally, because it just results in huge numbers, and it feels really good to pull off those, 10 to 15k crits in the middle of the fights. So let's talk about another option, another thing that might be pretty important for some folks, which is team composition. Let's talk about team composition. In the context of Empower and Rend. A lot of your effectiveness as a DPS in this game comes from being able to maintain both a 50% Empower, as much as possible, 50% is the cap, and a 70% Rend on the target, which reduces their armor. 70% is the cap. The amount of time that you and your party can maintain a 50% Empower on everybody and a 70% Rend on your target is directly proportional to how quickly you'll be able to defeat the boss and how much damage you'll be able to do. So, for the bow, here are your sources of Empower. You have 7% from the Honing Stone. You have 15% from Evasive Tactics. Alright, so that is the capstone for the left side tree. You should be taking Evasive Tactics. You get 15% every time you dodge. You have 15% from Oblivion, which you have access to if you're using the Life Taker. And you've got 10% from Keenly Empowered. Keep in mind the cap is 50%. If you add all this together, this is 47%. Alright, this is a total of 47% Empower. This is important because you don't want... Well, it's nice because you're never hitting the cap. No matter if you're getting all of these at the same time, if you're stacking all of your Empowers at once, you're never hitting the 50% cap, so you never have any wasted Empowers. This is also important because if you're using the Empowered perk on your jewelry, that means you will never waste that Empowered perk. Right? You'll always get 100% benefit from it. Other things to keep in mind that you might also have, if your party is geared this way, you might have a 10% Empower from Leadership. And you might have other sources of Empower, but generally if your tank is a Sword and Shield, they're either using Defensive Formation or they're using Leadership. If they're using Leadership, then you can actually put that also to good use, because it increases the uptime of your Empower, right? It just moves your Empower average from like 30% up to, say, 35 or 40%. So that's what we're going to say about Empower. Keep in mind, you want to be as close to the 50% cap as much as you can without going over. For Rends, Rend is a bit more of a complicated subject. It is very team specific because the 70% Rend is really hard to get to. If you're using Life Taker, it provides 30% of the Rend passively. Just by shooting the target. You get 30% Rend. And that lasts 100% of the time. It's always up. Bows also have 10% Rend on headshots. So if you're able to hit your headshots reliably and you've got 30% Rend from the Life Taker, you've got 40% of the Rend already taken care of. So we're going to make up the other 30%. Well, let's see. You can convince somebody to use a hatchet. Hatchet has Rending Throw. This is 20% Rend, 100% uptime. You can convince somebody to use a spear. Spears have a 15 to 30% Rend, depending on the mob's HP, with a 100% uptime. This is on Perforate. And finally, you can maybe convince somebody to use a Warhammer. Warhammers have Armor Breaker, which is a 30% Rend with 100% uptime. The rest of the Rends on the other weapons are less desirable. For instance, Skyward Slash on Greatsword is a 15% Rend, which does not have 100% uptime. If you're using Trenchant Rend, it does not have 100% uptime. So you're probably better off finding one of these three options to kind of fill in that Rend gap. If you have a bow and a Warhammer, your Rends are basically taken care of, and you're already at the cap. So try to coordinate between you and your team to see who's bringing what Rends, and make sure that they're always applied to whatever boss or monster that you're fighting at the time. All right, final topic we're going to talk about today during this guide is attacks and rotation. I'm not going to go too much into this, but generally you want to never delay an ability. Rain of Arrows, Poison Shots, always, whenever they are up. Delaying those never benefits you. You should always be using them. If you miss your poison shot, to be very careful about this, because if you miss your poison shot, you've missed a ton of damage. And it has a really long cooldown, so you will be waiting for a while before you can get that thing back up. Alright, so keep an eye on that. Try to always land your poison shots. Try to always land your big dots. And just keep those in mind. If you have rapid, with everything we discussed today, when you're using rapid shot, below 50% HP will have approximately 1 second cooldown. This means that you have just enough time, maybe just a little bit not enough time, to use one ability between each rapid shot. So you're going to do something like rapid shot and then poison shot, and then rapid shot again, and then rain of arrows, and then rapid shot again, and then a light arrow, a light attack, and then rapid shot again. You're just going to keep doing this over and over and over again until the boss dies. This assumes you hit all 3 arrows. Rapid shot is extremely good for high amounts of sustained DPS in that last 50% of a boss hit point bar. Wind up heavy attacks. Whenever you have downtime. With the boss's transitioning phases, you have 2 options. You can either stand there and look at them, or you can wind up a heavy attack to plug them as soon as they come out of it, as soon as they're attackable again. You should always be thinking about what can I do to, either wind up heavy attacks or use maybe a rain of arrows as soon as the thing becomes attackable and targetable. And then finally, this is really important. Try not to interrupt light attacks with abilities. This is really easy to do. I should say interrupt them. You'll get halfway through a light attack animation, then you'll push like poison shot, for instance, and that will interrupt the light attack, shoot the poison shot, and you have to go through the whole animation again. You should, if you can, try to aim for just after the light attack animation is finished, just after the bow leaves the arrow, then push the ability. This is the least amount of time that's wasted from your light attacks for using abilities. The worst that you could do is go through the whole thing, the whole animation, and then press the ability, and then you lose that entire attack. You have to go through the whole thing again. And that is it. Here is my bow build, by the way, right here. So you can go ahead and take a screenshot of this. This is optimized for maximum damage. I do take the third trait of the poison shot tree because it increases the direct hits of your poison shot to 100%. And really, if you're taking the rest of this, there's nothing better that I can think of that increases damage. There's a few things that might increase your survivability, but this is the thing that you want if you want to maximize damage. All right, folks. What did we talk about today? We talked about a lot of stuff. I'll put these notes in the comments, so just in case you missed anything, if you want to skip ahead and want to reference something, this is what you can do. First of all, armor. 4 refreshing. Gotta have that. Jewelry. You have a lot of things to take into consideration here, so try to aim for some very specific pieces of jewelry. Get those elemental protections on your amulets. Get the thrust and poison damage on your ring. Get the refreshing toast on your earring, and you're off to a good start. Best in slot bows. Farm for the syncretic bow if you want. That is named enemies in Brimstone Sands. You can craft on an elemental attunement onto that bow. It comes with keenly jagged. It comes with enchanted. It's really good. Alternatively, you can craft the oil jar from the Barnacles and Brimstone dungeon. Oil jar comes with enchanted and an elemental attunement. So then you can just craft on either keenly empowered or keenly jagged, and you're off to the races. Already comes at 700. Stats. Right here are my stats. Again, check the comments for more rationale about why I chose the stat attribution allocations that I did. Just showed you my talents. I love using the Life Taker as my offhand, but you might need to trade that out for spears in cases where you need to bring Enfeebling Skewer. Great swords for cases where you need to break stamina, and that's really it. So consider those offhand weapons for yourself. Maximize your empowers, maximize your rends, use your consumables. Check out my other video for that as well, which consumables you should be using. And you're going to be off to the races. You're going to be dealing some absolutely monstrous damage, I would say, with the bow. With this build, for instance, during this Tempest run, we can see. Let's see. Here's this boss. Look at this. Look at this right there. 16,272 damage. That is from the final attack on a rapid shot, headshot, boom, right there. All right, folks, listen. Thank you so much for joining me. I know I talked fast. I wanted to make sure we got all of this down in a reasonable amount of time. So thank you for sticking it out to the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure that you leave a comment. Make sure that you leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel as well. If you have any questions, please leave a comment, and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. Thank you, folks, and I'll see you next time. Take care.